Well, hello. Good to welcome you back to another episode of ideasSpace with the Urban Design Group, Urban Nous, and me, Christopher Martin. It's a really important time to be working in the built environment, and I'm hoping that with these conversations we can open up a discussion around the issues we need to better shape cities and societies around the world. And with this, perhaps the most impactful improvement to public life we can make in cities is to give more space to people on streets, to people walking and relaxing, because this leads to a more social streets, and I would argue a more accepting society, because we've created a more relaxing place and a less contested space. At the root of this is designing cities in such a way as to encourage us to spend more time in a public forum, because this increases the opportunity we have for social interaction, for exchange, for spontaneity, and for city life. And this is the root of urban and human success. It's what towns and cities are for. This is what society needs from them, and this is what makes us happy. And understanding what we as human beings need and want is vital to creating successful places. But how do we know what success looks like? To get to the bottom of this, I'm excited to be talking today with Professor Nick Tyler. Nick is a director of the UCL Centre for Transport Studies and Chadwick Professor of Civil Engineering, and investigate the ways in which people interact with their immediate environments. And importantly, Nick set up the Accessibility Research Group within the Centre for Transport Studies, which aims to identify projects that make the world more sympathetic to people's needs. And through his work at Pamela, the Pedestrian Environment Laboratory, and now a new facility called Pearl. Nick, great to have you with us. I want to ask, first of all, if you could maybe tell us about your work and research and the research laboratories of Pamela and now Pearl. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks, Chris, very much for that wonderful introduction. So this is a picture of the Pearl building. This is our new endeavour to try and create environments that we can examine what people do in them and how they interact with each other and the environment that we're having. So in order to do that, we have to build a big environment so that they're not aware that they're in something that we've constructed. So without delaying further, I can show you an example of the kind of things that we did. This is actually in our previous laboratory called Pamela, as mentioned earlier. This is where we built a tube train to see how people get on and off the tube train as we change the design of the train. And you can see there, it feels quite historical now. You see crowds of people getting on and off the train. And that was really to help London Underground to design a new tube train for London, which is due to roll out in 2024. But the first time ever that they have done the design of a train, taking the needs of the passengers in first, before they start doing the clever things with all the mechanicals. And we did that at life scale, and that's the kind of thing that we do. In Pearl, we have a slightly different kind of scale of facility. So that platform that you see there in the middle is the same size as the one that you were just looking at with the train on it. Wow. But in fact, as you can see already, that there are in that picture, there are a couple more. It's way higher than that other facility. And this platform is actually the size of the entire building that facility was in. Now, what you'll see there is it looks like a checkerboard, and that's because it's actually in the process of moving itself from being a flat surface to being a slope. So we can actually change the ground and change the profile of the ground. We can make it have bumps and slopes and holes and steps and things in it so that we can test how people deal with different kinds of, in this case, foot environment. We can change the nature of the surface there. So we can have, that is concrete, but we could actually have wood, we could have grass, we can have pretty much whatever you want in there. You'll see also there's a whole load of lighting at the top there. So we can see what that's going to do. Here's another view of it where you see those extending into the distance. So what we actually have here, we can build in there a 100-meter long street, full size, up to about 2 stories. And we can light that street, we can put sound in that street, we can have cars going in that street, we have people in that street, and we can see how they all come together and interact with each other so that we can begin to understand how the details of design affect the way that your body responds, how your brain responds, so that you can actually make what Chris was talking about earlier, this sense of sociality, of how people come together in an environment and do things together, which is the mark of society. And that's kind of what we're doing. We can change the lighting. So here you have some examples where we simply, in this particular case, you see orange lighting and yellow lighting and red lighting and straight white lighting. Actually, we can divide light up into 11 different wavebands within the spectrum. So you can have any color light, and we can actually program it to represent daylight from anywhere on the planet at any time of day, so that we can then test how you respond in different ways to different issues in the light. We also have a sound system, very sophisticated sound system. On the right is the sound preparation room we call the Vibe. In there we prepare 3D dynamic soundscapes, so we can move sound around in 3 dimensions. We can even make the sounds as if it's coming from behind the speakers as opposed to in front of them, things like that. On the left, you see some of the loudspeakers that we have in the main space. So we have about 200 loudspeakers there, and we can do things like run a train through the building, or create a rainforest, or you can trace a fly flying around the space, and you could locate it acoustically. Why do we do this? Well, we're looking at, this is a Jan Gehl image of Copenhagen with his 4-meter wide properties that make it very comfortable. Why is 4 meters such an important point? Well, he never figured that one out, but actually we can tell you that the reason is that's the kind of chunking rate that your brain does for information. So every 4 seconds, it's kind of revising itself to know what it's actually reviewing, and that everything is in order, and that rhythm is repeating, and that's why it feels comfortable to go past something where your stimulus is changing every 4 seconds. This is kind of the interior of the building that we're in, because we're not only using the laboratory space as part of our laboratory, everything else is part of the laboratory as well. So this is a space that is going to be a community art gallery, so that we can get people to feel space a lot more and understand more about what's going on in space, and to use it and to believe in it, and in the way that they're doing that. How we work in there, we have a space which is designed to be malleable, so we can create the spaces that we want in order to work. So we don't talk about workspace here, we talk about people space, and we make the space fit what the people want, and then we are able to do the working in there. So it's governed the choice of furniture, as well as the lighting and the acoustics and everything else in that space. On the way into Pearl, this is the entrance as it is now, you see this green surface with the pedestrian on it. That is, although the material is not a result of our research, putting it there is. This is the kind of surface material you'll see in a children's playground. Why is that there? Well, as you step onto that to approach the building, you begin to realize that you're actually in a different place. The surface is slightly softer. This surface will do much less damage to your knees and hips than the concrete surface next door to it. And this is just a marker that as you're coming towards Pearl, you're entering a different space. If we actually paved everywhere with that kind of surface, you would actually save a huge amount of damage to your knees and hips. In your lifetime, you're going to walk a couple of 100 million steps. Every step gives a shock wave through your skeletal system, and this will reduce that. And so we're studying how much we can actually do that in order to be able to give people a more comfortable social life. So that's kind of very, very quick rip through the kind of things that we're doing here. But very, very happy to expand on.
Yeah, no, I'd love to get into some more detail. A genuinely fascinating facility and a really exciting prospect. I mean, you sort of touched on that idea of a skeletal system there, and coming back to our sort of very origins. And I know you've previously said that human beings are designed for the savannah, and yet we live our lives in cities. So how can Pearl help us as urban designers sort of create human habitats that work for our nature, but also our modern ambitions?
Right. So the first thing is everything that you understand about the world comes through your senses. So we study the senses in some detail in here, and what that means, that's the reason that the building is all black inside, is because we have to take all of that away so that whatever sensory information you get is what we have put there. That's why we have the sound system and the lighting system, the smell system that we have, and also the physical design that we put into there. So everything in there is what we're doing. So we can test how you respond to that, both through the medium of your eyes, but also your body, your brain. So we can scan your brain while you are doing things there. So we can see how, if I change the environment in some way, how does that actually alter the way that you interact with it? So when you receive all this stuff in from the the world, your brain sort of kind of mulches it all up and it understands what that data is kind of telling it, and you then get a perception of what the world is. If I change something in the design of the environment, I'm going to change that perception, and on the basis of that perception is what I'm then going to do. And why we work in this way is because the data that you're actually getting in from your senses is very dramatic, but it's actually not that great. So if you take your eye, so your eye is closed for about 2/3 of the time. And the 1/3 that it's open, it receives information, it gets an image through the lens on the back of the eye. It has an image of what you see, of what's out there. But the information it gets from that image is simply that it has so many photons of long wavelength, so many photons of short wavelength, and so many photons of middle wavelength. That's what the brain has as data. And then it then figures out, well, if I've got that from my experience, my whole life's lived experience, from my genetic prepositions as to how I understand color and all of that, I am looking at whatever it is I'm looking at. And so the urban designer has to create an urban design that enables the people to be able to make that imaginative leap into whatever it is that you're designing. And that is what we are enabling urban designers to do in Pearl, is to be able to get the two ends of that process, what they design and build and what the person is actually receiving in that form of sensory data, that the brain is then going to understand that that's what they have built.
Very interesting. Yeah, thank you for that. I think you've spoken of rhythm already today, and I think and I know you've connected highway engineering and jazz before. Unlikely bedfellows in some people's mind, I'll grant you. And indeed, in my mind, sort of designing streets is designing places for individual lives to unfold, but collectively. And importantly, every experience is always different every time, and that's just like jazz. And I think coming back to that idea of rhythm, can you explain the sort of connection between jazz and highway engineering as you see it? And particularly how your work helps sort of us to move from a human scale to the city scale, rather than the city scale to the human scale, as has traditionally been the case.
Okay, so music, jazz, whatever kind of music, is, I think, a really, really interesting thing for engineering and highway engineering in particular to think about. So your brain works a lot on the basis of rhythm. So it understands rhythm, and it needs to understand that the difference between something which is kind of rhythmic and happening, not necessarily an even rhythm like a pulse, it could be anything, but it needs to understand, it can box it up and say, I understand that this is, for example, this is a waltz time, or this is a march time. They're different. And the brain can understand that because it chunks the information it gets into these 3 or 4 second chunks. So if it can fit things into that, and says, I understand that, so it feels comfortable. So you could take something like a grandfather clock that goes tick, tock, about every second. So you need about 4 seconds of that to establish that it is actually just being a repeated 1 second pulse. But why do we call it tick tock? Why isn't it tick tick? And the reason for that is that the brain, in making sense of that, says, I know what this is. This is a rhythm, a very simple rhythm, and one must be more important than the other. So I will emphasize one and not the other. And every language has that expression for a clock ticking, a slow clock ticking like a grandfather clock, of where they have one sound for one and one for the other. The two sounds are actually identical. Yes. It's we put that onto it. Now, jazz does exactly that. So jazz takes inspiration out of the environment and starts to play with it and formulate it in a form where they have various tricks and methods in order to be able to reproduce music and rhythm. So you're adding pitch to rhythm, if you like, giving it another dimension in a way that you can understand it. If you fail to understand the improvisation, you lose it, it doesn't work. So the jazz musician has to be able to play with that environment and bring you along with them as they exude complexity, if you like, to be able to do that. And in a sense, to me, the urban designer is kind of improvising, in the best sense of the word, improvising the design of the street so that people are brought along with it, that they feel content, they understand it without having to think why they understand it, and it just falls through. So the ability of a jazz musician to be able to play together with others, to be able to translate ideas and imaginations into sounds and rhythms that people can actually understand, that is actually where the connection happens. And we do a lot of work on how we use those rhythms and the understanding of rhythms to be able to help aid the way of designing.
It's a great way to look at it. I mean, I'm always speaking about the sort of the intrinsic connection between design and behaviour, and they can't separate them. So that idea of thinking around the sort of curating the space to basically compel people to act in certain ways is really interesting. And I think just touching more on sort of the complexities of the mind, if you don't mind, through your studies, you've worked extensively with people with dementia to better understand their needs and to better create a city for everyone. Can you tell us a bit about this work and importantly, the sort of key lessons from it?
Well, people with dementia, of course, they're having a pretty tough time. I mean, their brain is kind of changing, and they are very often very confused about those changes. And, they've lived with the ways of thinking and working and reacting and so on for most of their, or nearly all their life, and now they're suddenly finding this doesn't make sense anymore, and the brain is kind of going off on its own sort of pathway, and that's hard to understand. And so one of the things we have done is we started to work out what is it that a person with dementia actually sees. And then from there we realized that their eyes actually work perfectly well. As far as we can tell, the optic nerve, the passage of data from the eye to the brain, the kind of thing we were talking about earlier, that works pretty well. When it gets into the visual cortex, it starts to get mangled. So they're now trying to work out what that data is telling them. Now, when I described it before, what you get is a bunch of essentially wavelengths. How do I turn that into the image of a forest? Well, that is what the mind or the brain is trying to drive. And of course, that is the bit that's going wrong. So they may or may not see a forest, or they may see something. What they're trying to do is work out whatever these signals are that it's receiving, what do they mean? And my lived experience up to this point doesn't tell me. So that's the kind of source of the confusion. Just to add to that, another characteristic we found is about what we call fixations. And fixations, so your eyes basically are in motion. And I was talking about them earlier, and I said that they're only open for a third of the time. The other 2/3 of the time, they're moving. And what happens, if you imagine it's a bit like taking a picture, then closing your eyes, and then taking another picture, closing your eyes, and taking another picture. And where it takes the picture of is kind of determined by the preconscious brain. So things that draw your attention, it will tend to take more pictures of, and things that are boring, it won't. And so that's kind of how the eye works. And in the people, so normally, if I've watched how the eyes move, we can track that. For normal people, what you'll find is that the eye basically will cover sort of kind of the scene in its moves, and so you get this sort of picture of a whole scene sort of covered by the eye. With somebody with dementia, what we find is that they will only fixate in one bit of the scene, and that bit might be nothing in particular. It might just be the sky, or it might be the sea, but it won't. Normally, it would be attracted to things like people or buildings or something like that. Even if they're in the image, they just don't do it. What that tells us is if you just make a big sign for somebody with dementia saying, exit, they may only see the middle of the X. They may not see anything else at all. And so the only information that they got to work on is this bit of black. And so what's a bit of black? Well, what do I associate with bits of black in my life experience? It's a hole. It might be dark, nighttime. It's just, I don't know what it is. And so they not only are confused by it, they actually have no idea that it's actually a sign. And you'd be better to have a smaller sign than a bigger sign in many ways in order to get more of the word exit into the kind of area that they might be looking at. Alternatively, we may want to try and encourage them, if the eyes, to follow an image, to get more sense out of the image by maybe encouraging them to move a bit more. I don't know. I mean, that's the kind of thing we would like to explore. How can we actually help somebody with dementia make more sense of the environment, so that they can actually understand what they're in, so that it causes less confusion?
Yeah, fantastically important work. I really look forward to hearing how those sort of studies unfold. I think that'd be very valuable to urban designers and especially to everyone as well.
Well, I think just before you, I mean, I think actually that is all, we learn a fantastic amount from the people with dementia about how the rest of us function.
Yes.
And so actually the thought to take from that is, what do we do for everybody out of that kind of knowledge? And how do we actually get a better understanding of the environment for everybody, so that if that proportion of the population that will end up with something like dementia, they can actually make more sense of the world as well. But actually everybody makes more sense of the world if we get better understanding. Absolutely. Same thing with hearing and other aspects of vision as well. Absolutely,
and society and cities win the more people from different backgrounds can spend more time in cities. So I think that's always clearly hugely important. You've also spoken before a lot about your work in South America, and something I really love, the idea of creating the courteous city. I wonder if you could just touch on what is a courteous city to you, and how do we go about creating a more courteous city in London, in New York, everywhere?
Okay, so let me just explain where Courteous City comes from. I was doing a lot of work in the city of Medellin in Colombia. Now, Medellin was very famous in the 1990s as being the capital of drugs wars, with the highest murder rate in the world. They had 15,000 homicides a year. When you look at the numbers in London, for example, that would put that into perspective. And so the mayor at the time decided he actually had to do it. And he was given an opportunity, because one of the drug gang leaders, the sort of principal drug gang leader, came to him one day and said, look, I think I'm getting a bit worried about being shot. So I think you can arrest me and put me in prison, as long as I can build a prison. So the mayor said, oh, great, you build yourself a prison and go and put yourself in it, and I will fix the city. And so while this guy was in prison, he then set about trying to sort out the city. And one of the things that became very clear was people were very scared, they're very tense, they didn't trust anybody, and lots of other things. But that was the kind of beginning. And he realized that before he could even start thinking about what do I do about the streets or what do I do about transport, I've got to start thinking about, how do I get people to trust each other? How do I get people to love the city? And he realized that the essence of that was actually things like saying thank you to somebody who stopped when you wanted to cross the road, or saying after you in a queue, or these things. And so we conjured up this concept of the courteous city as being one of the fundamental pieces, that if you are in a city where society actually understands and accepts the importance of others, then you are in a city where you can start to do other things. And that was the starting point of Medellin transforming from the drugs capital of the world to a city that won, for example, the Lee Kuan Yew prize for the most innovative city in the world in 2016, 30 years later, less than a generation.
It will be a lovely sort of point to end on. But there's one more question I want to ask you, which is just, I suppose, much more practical in that, sort of how can we visit, how can we use, and how can we get involved in your research at Pearl? Okay, well, I love to hear from you all. So the way to do that is, at the moment, is you just send me an email. I'm very happy to sort of show you around. At the moment, right now, I'm sort of sitting in Pearl, but right now we're in the process of doing the snagging on the building. Anybody who's done snagging knows what a pain that is. So we're doing the snagging in the building. We're doing the commissioning of the equipment. As you can imagine, I've got 500,000 LEDs I've got to test, and that sound system takes some driving and all that sort of thing. So we've got to get all that running. So we're looking to get it into a state where we can actually start to do things and start to show people what we can do, probably in September. So it's better to come later on in September. We will be running things for people to come and look. And I'm very happy if people want to arrange to bring groups of people in, I think, first of all, to come and have a look.
because it's hard to explain. You've seen some pictures, but actually you kind of have to stand in it to get the feel of what it is and what we can do, and have that kind of discussion. So I would say sort of September onwards, I'm very, very happy to organise trips for people to come and have a look.
Fantastic. I'm sure the Urban Design Group will be taking you up on that for a walking tour. Look forward to it. Nick, I've really enjoyed talking to you and exploring these issues. Always more to talk about, but we are out of time. So I just want to thank you again, Nick, and I also want to thank everyone who's listening into this. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of ideasSpace by the Urban Design Group, Urban Nouse, and me, Christopher Martin. There's more episodes coming your way, so please do get in touch if you have any questions, and sign up to the Urban Design Group Urban Update to catch every conversation. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.